The most life-changing conversations often begin as jokes nobody takes seriously. Friday evenings always carried a different rhythm inside Bennett Global Holdings. The pressure of deadlines faded, coffee cups emptied more slowly, and even the city's endless skyline beyond the conference room windows seemed softer beneath the golden light of the setting sun. Ethan Carter quietly gathered his notebook while several department managers laughed about weekend plans. At 38 years old, Ethan had learned that nothing mattered more than getting home on time. His 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, always waited by the living room window every Friday, convinced she could recognize the sound of his aging silver sedan long before it reached their driveway. That simple tradition meant more to him than any executive title ever could. At the opposite end of the polished conference table, Victoria Hayes calmly finished reviewing the final quarterly report. As chief executive officer, she carried authority without demanding attention. She thanked interns with the same respect she showed senior executives, and because of that, people admired her far more than they feared her. One vice president jokingly mentioned another magazine calling Victoria one of the country's most eligible business leaders. The room filled with easy laughter. Someone else smiled and said that any man fortunate enough to marry her would need exceptional courage. Without thinking, Ethan looked toward Victoria and smiled with the relaxed honesty that had always defined him. "You would make a great bride someday," he said. The words floated across the conference room, and every conversation stopped. Several executives slowly turned toward Ethan, uncertain whether they had heard correctly. Nobody casually teased the chief executive officer during an executive meeting. Ethan immediately realized how unusual his comment sounded and chuckled awkwardly. "I only meant that whoever marries you will be very lucky." Victoria closed the report in front of her with quiet grace before lifting her eyes toward him. Instead of looking offended, she smiled warmly, almost as though his unexpected remark had awakened an old memory. "I would need a groom for that," she answered gently. The room instantly erupted with relieved laughter. Ethan laughed as well, rubbing the back of his neck with mild embarrassment, while several co-workers playfully shook their heads. The tension disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Employees gathered their laptops, exchanged cheerful goodbyes, and began leaving the conference room. Ethan picked up his worn leather messenger bag and headed toward the door, already thinking about Sophie's favorite Friday dinner and the blueberry pancakes he had promised to make the following morning. Just before he stepped into the hallway, Victoria's calm voice stopped him. "Mr. Carter." Ethan turned. Nearly everyone had already left. Only a few senior managers remained, quietly collecting documents while pretending not to notice the exchange. Victoria stood beside the long conference table with the same composed smile she always carried, yet something in her expression felt unexpectedly personal. "Would you stay for a few minutes?" she asked. Ethan glanced briefly at his watch. Sophie would still be safe with their kind next-door neighbor until he arrived home, but he disliked being late whenever he had given his daughter his word. Still, there was nothing demanding or uncomfortable in Victoria's request. It sounded sincere rather than official. "Of course," he replied politely. She waited until the final manager stepped outside and the heavy glass doors closed softly behind them. Silence settled across the spacious conference room as evening sunlight stretched long reflections over the polished table. Victoria reached for a discreet leather access card resting beside her folder, then looked back at Ethan with the same quiet smile that had followed her unexpected reply only moments before. "There is something," she said softly, "that I have hoped I would someday have the chance to show you." Victoria walked toward the private executive lounge without another word, and Ethan followed at a respectful distance, still wondering why a simple joke had suddenly become the beginning of such an unusual evening. The hallway outside the executive conference center was almost empty now. Most employees had already left the building to begin their weekends, leaving behind only the quiet sound of distant elevators and the soft hum of the climate control system. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline shimmered beneath the fading colors of sunset, painting long reflections across the polished marble floor. Victoria unlocked a discreet walnut door using the leather access card she had picked up moments earlier. The room beyond looked nothing like a corporate office. Instead of rows of computer screens and financial reports, warm bookshelves lined the walls beside comfortable leather chairs, Family photographs rested on wooden cabinets, and a fireplace glowed gently despite the mild spring evening outside. Ethan paused for a moment before stepping inside. The space felt peaceful, almost like someone had quietly hidden an ordinary living room in the middle of one of America's largest companies. Victoria motioned toward a chair near the fireplace. "Please make yourself comfortable." Ethan thanked her politely and sat down, carefully placing his worn leather messenger bag beside the chair. He still expected the conversation to return to business. Perhaps she wanted feedback on the quarterly presentation or wished to discuss a future project. Instead, Victoria walked toward an antique wooden cabinet standing near the far wall. She opened one drawer slowly before lifting out a small cedar box that had clearly been cared for over many years. She carried it with both hands, as though it contained something far more valuable than money. Ethan noticed the quiet reverence in her expression long before she spoke again. She placed the cedar box gently on the coffee table between them without opening it immediately. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence never felt uncomfortable. It carried the weight of memories waiting patiently to be acknowledged. Finally, Victoria looked toward Ethan with calm eyes filled more with gratitude than sadness. "Have you ever wondered," she asked softly, "whether one ordinary act of kindness can continue changing lives long after the person who offered it is gone?" Ethan thought about the question before answering honestly. "I believe it can. My late wife always used to say that kindness travels farther than we ever get to see." Victoria lowered her eyes for a brief moment, and a faint smile appeared. She was right. Ethan felt something shift quietly inside him. Victoria had spoken as though she already knew Emily, yet he had never mentioned his wife's name during any conversation at work. He searched her face, trying to understand whether he had misunderstood her words. Victoria rested one hand gently on the cedar box before slowly releasing the brass latch. The lid opened without a sound. Inside lay neatly folded handwritten letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon, an old photograph carefully protected inside a clear sleeve, and a pressed sunflower whose bright yellow petals had softened with time, but somehow still held their beauty. Ethan stared silently at the contents, unable to explain why his heartbeat had suddenly become louder than the quiet room around him. Victoria carefully lifted the photograph between her fingers, looked at it with unmistakable affection, and then raised her eyes to meet his once again. "Mr. Carter," she said gently, "before this evening is over, I believe you deserve to know why your family has quietly been part of my life for much longer than you could possibly imagine." Victoria held the photograph carefully between her fingers before sliding it across the coffee table toward Ethan. He reached for it almost instinctively, and the moment his eyes settled on the familiar smile, the room around him seemed to disappear. Emily stood beside a small folding table outside St. Andrew Community Church, wearing the same pale blue sweater she had loved every autumn. Several volunteers surrounded her, but her warm smile immediately captured every memory he had fought so hard to preserve. Ethan gently touched the edge of the photograph without saying a word. "Where did you get this?" he finally asked, his voice almost no louder than a whisper. Victoria folded her hands together and looked at the fireplace before answering. "I met your wife 12 years ago." Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward her. "At that time, my family's business was collapsing. My father had passed away only a few months earlier. Creditors called every day, and I had convinced myself that everything my parents had built would disappear. I stopped believing I belonged anywhere." She smiled faintly while looking at the photograph again. "One rainy Saturday, I walked into the community center because someone told me they were serving free coffee. I did not go there looking for hope. I only wanted a quiet place to sit." Ethan listened without interrupting. Victoria continued speaking with remarkable calm. "Your wife was helping organize donations. She noticed that I had been sitting alone for almost an hour. She walked over carrying a cup of coffee and asked if anyone had smiled at me that day. I remember laughing because it felt like such an unusual question." Victoria reached into the cedar box and carefully untied the faded blue ribbon wrapped around several handwritten letters. "We talked for nearly 2 hours. I never told her who I was or what my family owned. She never asked. She simply treated me like another person who deserved kindness." Ethan lowered his head as countless memories returned. That sounded exactly like Emily. She had always believed that people should never be measured by titles or bank accounts. Victoria gently unfolded one of the letters. A week later, this arrived in the mail. She handed it to Ethan. The familiar handwriting immediately filled his eyes with emotion. Emily had written only one page, yet every sentence carried the same quiet wisdom she had shared throughout their marriage. The final line read, "The world changes one kind decision at a time, even when nobody notices." Ethan smiled through moist eyes. She wrote that sentence in birthday cards, grocery lists, even lunch notes. Victoria nodded softly. "I carried this letter everywhere. Whenever another business deal failed or another investor refused to believe in me, I read those words again." She paused briefly before continuing. "Eventually, our company recovered. Years later, we expanded beyond anything my parents had imagined. Reporters always asked what inspired me to keep going. I never mentioned profits or ambition because neither one saved me. A woman I barely knew reminded me that my value did not depend on success." Ethan carefully returned the letter to Victoria with the same respect someone might show a priceless family heirloom. "Emily never told me any of this," he said quietly. Victoria smiled. "That does not surprise me. She never performed kindness for recognition. She believed the greatest acts of generosity should remain almost invisible." Ethan looked once more at the photograph resting between them. For years he had believed Emily's influence ended with the people she loved most. Now he was beginning to understand that her quiet compassion had traveled farther than either of them had ever imagined. And sitting across from him was living proof that one ordinary afternoon inside a small community church had quietly shaped the future of an entire company. The quiet warmth of the executive lounge lingered long after Victoria finished speaking. Neither of them reached for another word immediately, because some truths deserved silence before they deserved conversation. Outside the panoramic windows, evening slowly surrendered to the glittering lights of downtown Chicago, while the fireplace continued casting gentle shadows across the cedar box resting on the coffee table. Ethan carefully folded Emily's letter exactly the way Victoria had preserved it for more than a decade before placing it beside the photograph. He smiled softly, although his eyes remained bright with emotion. "She would never have imagined this," he whispered. Victoria nodded. "Neither would I." She stood and walked toward a built-in cabinet near the fireplace, opening another drawer before removing a slim black leather portfolio. Unlike the weathered cedar box, this folder looked almost new. She returned to the coffee table and placed it beside Emily's letters. Ethan looked at it with quiet curiosity. "There is one more thing I believe you deserve to see," Victoria said calmly. She opened the portfolio and slowly turned it toward him. The first page displayed Bennett Global Holdings Human Resources records. Ethan immediately recognized his own name printed neatly. Across the top, he looked at Victoria with visible confusion. "My personnel file?" Victoria smiled gently. "Part of it." Ethan carefully began turning the pages. Annual performance reviews, project evaluations, leadership assessments, mentoring reports, and letters of recommendation filled the folder. Every review praised his professionalism, reliability, honesty, and willingness to help coworkers without seeking recognition. Attached to several pages were handwritten executive notes. One read, "Quiet leadership builds lasting trust." Another simply stated, "Consistent integrity deserves opportunity." Ethan looked up. "You wrote these?" Victoria nodded. "Only the personal observations. The evaluations came from your supervisors, department directors, and executive committees." Ethan remained silent as he continued reading. Every promotion, salary adjustment, and leadership assignment included detailed explanations supported by measurable performance. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing suggested favoritism. Victoria folded her hands comfortably before continuing. "The first time your file reached my office was nearly 6 years ago during executive succession planning. I noticed one detail immediately." Ethan already knew the answer before asking. "Emily?" Victoria nodded again. "When I saw her listed as your emergency contact at that time, I wondered if she could possibly be the same woman who had changed my life years earlier." Human Resources quietly confirmed only one fact. She had passed away. Ethan lowered his eyes. Victoria continued gently. "From that day forward, I made one promise to myself. I would never allow my gratitude toward Emily to influence your career. Every promotion discussion involving your name followed the same process. Whenever executive voting began, I quietly excused myself from the room." Ethan looked at her with genuine surprise. You left? Every single time, she answered. I wanted every decision concerning your future to belong entirely to your achievements. I refused to create even the appearance of favoritism. Ethan slowly examined another recommendation signed by 3 different vice presidents praising his mentorship of younger employees. Another described how he had voluntarily stayed late for weeks, helping a struggling department complete a critical project without requesting overtime recognition. Victoria smiled quietly. You earned every opportunity because people trusted your character long before they admired your results. Ethan closed the folder gently and rested both hands upon it. I never realized anyone noticed those little things. Victoria's answer came almost immediately. The right leaders always notice. They simply believe genuine character should be rewarded quietly rather than celebrated loudly. Ethan looked once more toward Emily's photograph resting beside the portfolio. For years he had believed he was honoring his late wife simply by raising Sophie with kindness. Only now was he beginning to understand that every ordinary decision he made had quietly carried Emily's legacy into places she had never lived long enough to see. And sitting across from him was someone whose entire future had once been changed by the very same quiet grace. Neither of them realized how late it had become until the city lights outside completely replaced the fading colors of sunset. The executive lounge felt less like part of a corporate headquarters and more like a quiet refuge where 2 lives had unexpectedly crossed because of one woman's extraordinary kindness. Ethan carefully closed the black leather portfolio before placing it beside the cedar box containing Emily's letters. He looked toward Victoria with sincere gratitude. Thank you, he said softly, not only for showing me this, but for protecting the fairness of my career all these years. Victoria smiled gently. I was not protecting your career. I was protecting your dignity. Emily deserved that, and so did you. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before quietly replying. She always believed dignity mattered more than recognition. Victoria nodded. I know. She taught me that before I even understood the difference. After a comfortable silence settled between them once again, Victoria glanced toward the clock resting above the fireplace. You promised your daughter you would be home, she said with a warm smile. Ethan laughed quietly. She keeps track of every Friday. Victoria walked with him toward the private elevator connecting the executive lounge to the underground parking level. Before pressing the elevator button, she hesitated briefly. May I ask you something? Ethan nodded. Of course. Victoria folded her hands comfortably in front of her. Would you allow me to meet Sophie someday? Ethan looked genuinely surprised, but there was no hesitation in his expression. Why would you want to? Victoria smiled with complete honesty. Because I spent years wishing I could thank the woman who changed my life. I cannot do that anymore. But perhaps I can honor her by getting to know the family she loved most. Ethan looked down for a thoughtful moment before smiling. Sophie loves meeting kind people. She judges everyone by whether they listen more than they speak. Victoria laughed softly. Then I hope I pass the test. The elevator doors opened quietly. Ethan stepped inside before turning back toward her. Would you like to come by tomorrow morning? Sophie and I usually make blueberry pancakes together every Saturday. Victoria's eyes brightened with quiet surprise. I would love that. Our house is not very impressive, Ethan added with a modest smile. It does not need to be, Victoria answered. The people inside are what matter. As the elevator descended toward the parking garage, Ethan leaned gently against the wall, replaying the entire evening in his mind. He had entered the conference room expecting nothing more than another routine executive meeting. Instead, he had discovered that Emily's quiet compassion had reached farther than either of them had ever imagined. Above him, Victoria remained standing in the silent hallway for another minute after the elevator doors closed. She looked once more toward the cedar box resting safely inside the executive lounge before whispering almost to herself, You never stop changing lives, Emily. The following morning arrived beneath a bright blue Chicago sky. Warm sunlight filtered through the curtains of Ethan's modest suburban home, while the aroma of fresh coffee, sizzling butter, and homemade pancake batter filled the cheerful kitchen. Sophie stood on a wooden stool beside the counter arranging fresh blueberries into tiny smiling faces while humming a tune her mother had once sung. Ethan smiled as he watched his daughter carefully concentrate on every small detail. The familiar sound of a doorbell echoed gently through the house. Sophie looked toward the front door with wide, curious eyes. "Dad?" she asked happily. "Is our special guest here already?" The front door opened, and Victoria stood on the porch holding a simple bouquet of fresh sunflowers tied together with a pale blue ribbon. She wore comfortable weekend clothes instead of her usual executive attire. And for the first time, Ethan saw her without the quiet formality that naturally surrounded her at the office. She smiled warmly. "I was told I should not arrive empty-handed." Ethan laughed softly. "You were given very good advice." Before he could say anything else, Sophie appeared beside him with bright, curious eyes. She looked first at the flowers and then at Victoria. "Are those for us?" she asked. Victoria knelt until they were at eye level. "They are, if you would like them." Sophie accepted the bouquet with both hands as though it were something precious. "Mom loved sunflowers," she said innocently. Victoria's gentle smile never faded, but Ethan noticed the emotion that briefly crossed her face. "I know," she answered quietly. Sophie tilted her head. "How do you know?" Ethan looked toward Victoria, allowing her to answer in her own way. Victoria spoke honestly without overwhelming the little girl. "Your mother once showed kindness to someone who needed it very much. I have never forgotten her." Sophie smiled with complete acceptance, as children often do when they recognize sincerity. "Then you must be one of Mom's friends." Victoria nodded gently. "I hope so." Inside the cozy kitchen, the aroma of fresh pancakes, maple syrup, and brewed coffee filled every corner of the house. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating family photographs displayed along the walls. None of the furniture was expensive, yet every room reflected warmth, care, and quiet happiness. Sophie proudly invited Victoria to help decorate the pancakes with blueberries and sliced strawberries. Victoria laughed softly as Sophie insisted that every pancake needed a smiling face before it could be served. Ethan watched them together while pouring coffee into 3 mugs, realizing how naturally the conversation flowed despite the fact they had never met before. There was no awkwardness, no effort to impress one another, only simple kindness filling the room. During breakfast, Sophie happily shared stories about school, her science project, and the small vegetable garden she and her father were growing in the backyard. Victoria listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged the little girl to speak even more enthusiastically. Ethan noticed something unusual. Sophie rarely opened up to strangers this quickly. Yet somehow she trusted Victoria almost immediately. After breakfast, Sophie disappeared upstairs before returning carefully carrying a small wooden memory box decorated with hand-painted blue flowers. "Dad and I look at this sometimes," she explained. "It helps us remember Mom." Ethan smiled gently, giving his daughter permission with a quiet nod. Sophie placed the box on the dining table and slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested handwritten recipes, birthday cards, pressed flowers, old family photographs, and tiny keepsakes collected throughout Emily's life. Victoria looked at every item with deep respect, never touching anything until Sophie invited her to. One handwritten recipe made all 3 of them laugh because Emily had written a playful note reminding herself never to forget the vanilla again. Another photograph showed Ethan and Emily standing beneath a field of blooming sunflowers years before Sophie was born. The room grew peacefully quiet as memories settled around them like warm morning light. Nobody felt the need to hurry the moment. Victoria understood that she had not been invited into an ordinary house. She had been welcomed into a family's living history, built not upon wealth or achievement, but upon love that continued to guide every ordinary day even after loss. Sitting beside Ethan and Sophie, she quietly realized that Emily's greatest legacy had never been contained inside letters or photographs. It lived naturally within the kindness this father and daughter continued giving to the world every single day. The peaceful weekend passed more quickly than any of them expected, yet something quiet had changed before Monday morning arrived. Victoria drove back to the office carrying far more than pleasant memories of blueberry pancakes and laughter. She carried a renewed understanding of the culture she wanted Bennett Global Holdings to represent. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to his ordinary routine without expecting anything from the extraordinary conversation they had shared. He parked his familiar silver sedan in the employee garage before sunrise, greeted the security officers by name, and stopped to help a new intern carry several heavy presentation boards into the lobby. It was the same kindness he showed every day, never realizing how many people quietly noticed. Inside the executive offices, Victoria reviewed the agenda for the weekly leadership meeting. One item immediately caught her attention. An anonymous message had reached the Human Resources Department over the weekend suggesting that Ethan's recent professional opportunities were the result of favoritism rather than merit. The accusation contained no evidence, only assumptions created after employees had seen Ethan leaving the executive floor on Friday evening. Victoria closed the document slowly. She did not appear angry. Instead, she looked quietly disappointed that suspicion could spread so easily while integrity often traveled in silence. During the executive meeting later that morning, several senior leaders cautiously raised concerns about workplace perception. No one directly criticized Ethan, but the implication was obvious. Victoria listened without interrupting until every opinion had been respectfully expressed. Only then did she open another folder resting beside her notebook. "Every promotion Mr. Carter has ever received was approved without my participation," she said calmly. "Whenever his name appeared before an executive committee, I removed myself from the room to guarantee complete fairness." Several board members looked at one another with visible surprise. Victoria continued in the same composed voice. "His performance evaluations were written independently by department leaders over many years. His results consistently exceeded expectations, and his reputation for honesty has been documented long before I ever knew he was connected to someone who once changed my life." The room grew completely still. One executive quietly reviewed the records now displayed on the conference screen. Every achievement, every recommendation, every promotion, and every leadership assignment was supported by years of objective evaluations. There was no shortcut, no special treatment, and no hidden advantage. Only steady excellence built through patience and character. Victoria closed the folder once more. "Our responsibility is not merely to reward success," she said gently. "Our responsibility is to protect fairness so completely that integrity never has to defend itself." No one argued. No one needed to. The evidence spoke with far greater strength than emotion ever could. Later that afternoon, Ethan continued mentoring two newly hired employees without knowing anything about the discussion that had taken place upstairs. He patiently explained complicated project procedures, encouraged their questions, and reminded them that asking for help was always a sign of commitment rather than weakness. From the glass wall of her office, Victoria happened to see the conversation below. She smiled quietly because nothing about Ethan changed after receiving recognition he never expected or criticism he never heard. He remained exactly the same man Emily had married years earlier. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the office floor, Victoria began writing a single sentence at the top of a blank page for the company's upcoming annual gathering. She paused only once before carefully finishing the line. "Character is the greatest investment any organization can make." Looking out across the busy offices filled with hundreds of employees, she realized the time had finally come for an entire company to learn where its strongest values had truly begun. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected announcement that immediately became the only topic anyone discussed throughout Bennett Global Holdings. Every employee received an invitation to gather in the main auditorium on Friday afternoon for a special company event. The message contained no explanation beyond a simple sentence stating that attendance was encouraged for every department. Rumors spread quickly through every floor of the headquarters. Some employees expected a major acquisition. Others predicted an executive restructuring or the announcement of a new international expansion. Ethan paid little attention to any of the speculation. He arrived at work as he always did, greeted the reception staff by name, helped a maintenance employee move several heavy supply boxes into a storage room, and quietly focused on preparing a client presentation due later that week. His routine never changed because of rumors. Victoria, however, spent those same days preparing something entirely different. Inside her private office, she carefully arranged the cedar box, Emily's handwritten letter, the faded photograph from St. Andrew Community Church, and a framed picture of a field filled with blooming sunflowers. She reviewed her speech several times before quietly setting every page aside. She realized the story could never be told from prepared notes. It had to come from gratitude. Friday afternoon finally arrived. Hundreds of employees filled the spacious auditorium beneath warm lights reflecting from polished wooden floors. Executives sat beside interns. Managers shared tables with receptionists, accountants, engineers, custodians, and customer service representatives. Victoria intentionally avoided reserved seating because she believed respect should never depend upon job titles. Ethan entered with his department, unaware that the afternoon would become one of the most meaningful moments of his life. As conversations slowly faded, Victoria walked onto the stage carrying only the cedar box. No presentation screen appeared behind her. No financial charts decorated the stage. She placed the box gently upon a wooden podium before looking across the audience with calm confidence. Today is not about profits, she began softly. It is not about expansion, shareholders, or quarterly performance. Today is about the quiet foundation upon which this company truly stands. The auditorium became completely silent. Victoria slowly opened the cedar box and lifted the familiar photograph for everyone to see. Many years ago, she continued, I met a woman who never knew my position, my family name, or the challenges I carried. She saw only another human being who needed kindness. Ethan immediately recognized Emily's smile in the photograph. His hands slowly tightened together as emotion quietly filled his eyes. Victoria carefully unfolded Emily's handwritten letter and held it with unmistakable respect. The woman who wrote these words changed my life. She reminded me that one kind decision could travel farther than any business success ever would. She paused briefly before looking directly toward Ethan. Years later, I discovered that her husband had been working inside this company for many years. He never asked for special treatment because he never knew our connection existed. Every promotion, every opportunity, and every achievement he earned belonged entirely to his own integrity. Hundreds of employees instinctively turned toward Ethan. Victoria smiled gently. Mr. Ethan Carter, would you please join me? Ethan slowly walked toward the stage, humbled by the attention he had never wanted. When he reached her, Victoria faced the audience once more. Beginning today, Bennett Global Holdings will honor the values that built our culture by establishing the Emily Carter Kindness Award. Each year it will recognize employees whose quiet compassion changes lives without seeking recognition. Businesses succeed through strategy, but they become meaningful through character. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Then the entire auditorium rose together in a standing ovation that seemed to continue without end. Ethan looked toward Emily's smiling photograph and quietly understood something he had never fully realized before. Love measured by kindness never disappears. It simply continues growing inside the lives it quietly transforms. Several months passed with a quiet rhythm that no longer felt unfamiliar. Spring gradually gave way to early summer, and life settled into a peaceful routine that none of them had planned, yet all of them quietly cherished. The Emily Carter Kindness Award quickly became one of the most respected traditions inside Bennett Global Holdings. Employees no longer competed only for impressive sales numbers or ambitious promotions. They began looking for opportunities to encourage coworkers, support struggling families, mentor young professionals, and quietly serve their communities. Victoria often smiled whenever she walked through the headquarters because she could see Emily's influence living inside people who had never even known her name. Ethan continued leading projects with the same humility that had always defined him. He never mentioned the award during meetings, never reminded anyone of the standing ovation, and never allowed recognition to change the way he treated others. Every Friday evening, he still hurried home because Sophie continued waiting beside the front window, waving excitedly the moment his familiar silver sedan turned onto their quiet suburban street. Victoria became a welcome guest rather than a formal visitor. She joined their Saturday breakfasts whenever her schedule allowed, helped Sophie plant sunflowers in the backyard, and discovered that the happiest moments in life rarely appeared on business calendars. One warm Saturday afternoon, Sophie carefully measured the tallest sunflower before running toward Ethan and Victoria with obvious excitement. I think Mom would love these, she said proudly. Ethan smiled warmly. I think she already does. Victoria looked across the small garden where bright yellow flowers gently swayed beneath the summer breeze. She certainly left something beautiful behind. A few weeks later, Bennett Global Holdings held its annual Family Appreciation Celebration beside a peaceful lakeside park outside Chicago. Employees arrived with spouses, children, grandparents, and lifelong friends. Music floated softly through the warm evening air, while colorful lanterns hung beneath tall oak trees. Picnic tables overflowed with homemade food, children laughed across wide green lawns, and conversations replaced business discussions. Ethan arrived carrying a homemade apple pie that Sophie insisted they bake together the previous evening. Victoria greeted every family personally without the distance usually associated with a chief executive officer. When she reached Ethan and Sophie, the little girl smiled brightly before taking Victoria's hand. Come with us, Sophie said happily. There is something I want to show you. She led both adults toward a small field of blooming sunflowers planted near the edge of the park. The golden blossoms stretched toward the evening sky exactly as Emily had once described in one of her handwritten letters. Sophie looked from her father to Victoria before asking the question only a child could ask with complete honesty. Dad, are you happy when Miss Victoria is with us? Ethan looked toward Victoria before answering with gentle certainty. Yes, I truly am. Sophie then turned toward Victoria. Are you happy when you are with us? Victoria felt her eyes quietly fill with grateful emotion, yet her smile remained peaceful, more than you could possibly imagine. Sophie nodded with complete satisfaction. Then I think Mom already knew this would happen someday. None of them hurried to answer. Ethan slowly reached for Victoria's hand, and she welcomed the gesture with quiet confidence rather than surprise. Around them, laughter continued. Children played beneath the evening sky, and warm sunlight settled across the field of sunflowers. No dramatic announcement interrupted the moment. No grand declaration demanded applause. Three ordinary people simply stood together in peaceful silence, connected forever by one woman whose kindness had quietly changed every life she touched. In the end, the greatest love story was never built upon wealth, status, or perfect timing. It was built upon dignity, grace, second chances, and the quiet courage to keep choosing kindness until kindness gently led everyone home.